So now we want to look at why people on the autism spectrum tend to prefer their special activity to spend time and energy with that as opposed to spending time and energy with their special person, which in this case would be their neurotypical spouse. So if I have autism spectrum disorder, by default, I have this thing called mind blindness. Simply put, it's hard for me to predict what might be in the mind of other individuals, what they might be thinking, and that creates a cascade of problems because now, if I don't understand how they think, I also don't understand why they say and do the things they do. I don't understand their motives. I don't understand their perspectives, and so I'm lost in that regard. Also with ASD, if I am wired that way, I have alexithymia, which means that I have, in addition to mind blindness, I have emotions blindness. I don't understand how I feel. I don't understand how other people feel. I don't get the connection between their facial cues, body language, and how they're feeling. I don't get the connection between their tone of voice, volume of voice, wordage, and how that connects to their feelings. So there again, I'm lost. So being so out of touch with others in the social and emotional sense creates a lot of unpredictability in my life. I don't understand how I feel. I don't understand how you feel. I don't understand how you think, why you behave the way you do, why you say the things you do. I'm so out of the loop that I live 24/7, 365 days a year in some state of unpredictability. And this chronic low-grade unpredictability that manifests at home, in the workplace, and otherwise creates mild low-grade anxiety in me 24/7, 365 days a year. So living a life of chronic low-grade anxiety puts me in a position to want to reduce that anxiety. So I come up with a host of anxiety reduction strategies. That's going to be some version of a meltdown, mild to severe, and or some version of a shutdown, mild to severe. Or I may engage in false agreement. In other words, I just give you the indication that I'm going along with what you want and what you're saying, just basically to get you to stop talking to me and end the conversation because it's getting too stressful. But one of the most important things that I do with this chronic low-grade anxiety due to so much unpredictability in my life is I create a lot of structure and routine. Since things are so unpredictable, I try to make them as predictable as I can, and that is through providing myself with a set of routines, a set of rules, a certain structure that I must abide by to keep my anxiety at bay. And one of the best ways that I can achieve this business of routine and structure is to find an activity that I enjoy and become totally hyper-focused and engrossed in that activity. Because now I have super predictability and I have super anxiety reduction when I am totally absorbed and mesmerized by and in my special interest. Whether that's my work or some hobby or some computer game, you name it. There's a multitude of different things there. So this creates a problem for me socially because now the people that supposedly want to connect with me have a great difficulty connecting with me because I'm gone. I'm spending more time and energy and more passion with my special interest than with my special person or my special people. And they feel left out, ignored, disrespected. They view me as being selfish, uncaring, insensitive, narcissistic, and even sociopathic. And they feel emotionally deprived. She may even claim that she has Cassandra syndrome. All of this is not what I want, and it raises my anxiety even more, which makes me engage in my special activity even more, which creates more distance between me and my special person or my special people, and which makes me in turn want to spend more time with my special activity. So in summary, my spending a lot of quality time with my object of preference, which is probably nothing to do with anything social, is my structure my routine, my anxiety reduction strategy. So I have a chronic special interest to deal with my chronic anxiety. So if I have ASD, I'm going to have a lot of routine and structure, which means I'm going to have a lot of rules. I'm going to be the type of person that wants things to be done in a certain way at a certain time. I don't want my routine interrupted. I don't want to have to shift my focus from what I'm doing now to tending to somebody else's needs or wants or desires. So I'm going to be very rule-oriented. I'm going to be super resistant to any kind of change, especially unexpected change. And when my routine gets interrupted, that's when my anxiety comes up, and that's when the significant people in my life are probably going to witness me doing some version of a meltdown or a shutdown. So in this way, a meltdown or a shutdown or a combination thereof is really nothing more than anxiety overload, which in turn means I'm going to soon go back to reducing that anxiety, which means I'm back to my special interest again. So in a nutshell, my special activity is always highly predictable, whereas my special person is most often highly unpredictable. Okay, so now we want to look at why your partner or spouse with high-functioning autism tends to blame you for the relationship difficulties. If you, for example, are a neurotypical wife in a marriage with a husband with Asperger's syndrome, you probably have discovered that whenever there are issues or conflict, you are the bad guy, and he blames you for the relationship difficulties. And you may have had the thought many times, he is such a selfish, insensitive, uncaring bastard. And what if I were to tell you that that's probably not the case? Rather, the fact that he's not responding the way you would hope is due to one of the traits that he suffers from. We're specifically talking about theory of mind deficits. So let's look at that briefly. Theory of mind is an important social cognitive skill that involves the ability to think about mental states, both your own and those of others. It involves the ability to attribute mental states, including emotions, desires, beliefs, and knowledge. Not only does the theory of mind involve thinking about thinking, but it also refers to the ability to understand the ability to understand that others' thoughts and beliefs may be different from your own, and to consider the factors that have led to those mental states. Now, why is this called theory of mind? Well, psychologists refer to this as a theory of mind because our beliefs about what might happen or what might be going on in another person's head are just that, theories. They're kind of educated guesses. While we make predictions, we can definitely make predictions, but we have no direct way of knowing exactly what a person might be thinking or what their motivations might be. All we can rely on is our own theories or hypotheses that we develop based on what people say, how they act, what we know about their personalities, and what we can infer about their intentions. So why is this theory of mind stuff so important? Well, the emergence of a theory of mind is really critical during the developmental process. Very young children tend to be more egocentric, as I'm sure the parents in here are aware of, and are often unable to think about the mental states of others. Now, as people age, their theory of mind does emerge and continues to develop. So forging a strong theory of mind plays an important role in our social worlds as we work to understand how people think, to predict their behavior, to engage in social relationships, to solve interpersonal conflicts, and so on. So in order to interact with other people, it's important to be able to understand their mental states and to think about how those mental states might influence their actions. So in other words, you connect your guesstimate about what they're thinking with your guesstimate about how they may act based on their thinking. And this is all stuff that you do at a very unconscious level as a neurotypical. These things come about almost at just automatically. It's a natural state of mind, not so much with people with Asperger's. The theory of mind allows people to infer the intentions of others, as well as to think about what's going on in someone else's head, including hopes, fears, beliefs, expectations, and so on. So social interactions, as you know, can be very complex. even for neurotypicals, and misunderstandings can make them even more complex and confusing. By being able to develop accurate ideas of what other people are thinking, or at least fairly accurate ideas, we're better able to respond accordingly. So here is the problem. People with Asperger's and high functioning autism have great difficulty with this theory of mind business. In fact, there's a lot of research on this that reveals that people on the autism spectrum have trouble using theory of mind to make moral judgments in many situations. There was one study that specifically found that Asperger's adults were more likely than neurotypical subjects to blame other people for their problems. And this is what I say, you may have experienced this with your husband who has Asperger's syndrome. So the judgments of people with Asperger's rely more on outcome of the incident rather than on understanding the other person's intentions. Let me state that again. The judgments of people with Asperger's and high functioning autism tend to rely more on the outcome of the incident rather than on understanding the other person's intentions. Here's an example, and this was part of the research. And in one scenario, James had a friend, and they were snowmobiling in an area known for loose snow. So this friend asks James if he should take an easterly route around a row of pine trees. And James had looked it up, and he did a little quick analysis while they were on the slopes, and he found out that they had an alert that avoiding the west slope was the safest way to go. And so he told his friend that going, the east route would probably be okay. So the friend takes off in that direction, but unfortunately starts an avalanche, which quickly overtook him and buried him alive. Now, in this scenario, and this was just a hypothetical scenario that the researchers put forth before these subjects, the researchers found that people with Asperger's were more likely than neurotypical subjects to blame James for his friend's death, even though James believed the slope was harmless. So that was kind of an interesting research project that does reflect the fact that judgments of people with Asperger's do tend to rely more on outcomes rather than on inferring what the other person's intentions were. So that was a long way around the bush to get to the point, and that is, this is why your partner or spouse with Asperger's or high-functioning autism does tend to blame you for the relationship difficulties, because he's only looking at the outcomes, in other words, what happened after the argument, rather than trying to understand your thoughts, feelings, motivations, intentions, and so on. Today I want to talk to the neurotypical wives, and I have a question for you. Did you realize that your spouse with ASD may actually be afraid to discuss relationship difficulties with you? You probably knew that, right? Because whenever you tried to discuss relationship problems with him, he either gave you the illusion that he was listening just to hurry up and get the conversation over with, or he did some version of a meltdown or a shutdown. So that should be evidence to you that he is literally afraid that the conversation, quote unquote, will deteriorate into yet another fight. Now, as you know, ASD level 1 or high functioning autism is a developmental disorder, which means that developmentally your spouse on the spectrum has a social emotional brain that is underdeveloped. In other words, he is low in social and emotional intelligence. This also means that his social and emotional needs are significantly lower than yours. So, when you want to discuss relationship issues with your ASD husband, you are, of course, going to be using your highly developed social and emotional intelligence as you try to make your points. Why wouldn't you? However, your ASD husband is listening with a highly logical brain that is also low in social and emotional competency. Therefore, he is not tracking your important message. It's like you are very fluent in German, but he speaks just a little tiny bit of German. So as you're talking, he's only understanding and retaining about 10% of the total information, and he knows it. The typical partner on the autism spectrum knows that he is not fully understanding what his NT wife is thinking and feeling, and this honestly in some cases makes him feel stupid. The NT wife eventually realizes that her husband doesn't get it. She feels as though she has wasted her time and energy in trying to make him understand what she needs. So she understandably complains that he doesn't get it and may even accuse him of not caring and not listening. So this complaint now downloads in the autistic brain as criticism, disrespect, and ridicule. So this is why the man with ASD hates having difficult conversations with his wife. Now he feels stupid and chastised. He may think something along the lines of this: I don't understand what she is saying or feeling, which makes me feel dumb, and then I get in trouble for being dumb. So maybe you can see why difficult conversations about relationship problems would be something that he dreads. And when the NT wife says something along the lines of, well, we need to talk, you can be assured that his anxiety instantly increases as he forecasts yet another bad outcome. That would be a heated argument that yields no solution. So many men on the autism spectrum have literally reported that they are afraid of their NT wife, and they have used that term, afraid. They know that when there has to be a discussion on relationship problems, they're not going to fully grasp her perspective, and they're also going to be in trouble for not being able to grasp it. So most often, the ASD man will try to avoid these difficult conversations, and if that's not possible, he'll hurry up and agree to whatever you say purely to get the conversation over with as soon as possible, which instantly reduces his fear and the associated anxiety.
I got an email from a neurotypical woman who's in a relationship with a man with Asperger's syndrome, and she's asking, why is my husband so sensitive to criticism? It seems as though everything I say, he perceives that as me being critical, and then he gets very defensive, and then the arguments start. Well, in order to answer that question, we really have to talk about the amygdala, which, as many of you know, is just a part of your brain. But it's more than just any old part. It is the fear center of the brain. It helped us survive back in the day, quite honestly. And people with Asperger's syndrome do tend to have an overly active and even in some cases physically enlarged amygdala. And so that would explain briefly, why they have such anxiety. The disorder comes with anxiety, but also they grew up in an environment that reinforced that anxiety, namely knowing that they just could not fit in socially. The link between the amygdala and fear processing does indeed shed a lot of light on how anxiety can take root in a child's mind, the child having high-functioning autism or Asperger's, and then develop into long-term problems as an adult. Now, the link between the amygdala and anxiety served us really well back, 2 million years ago, when we were cavemen and we were facing life-threatening dangers every day. So let's say, for example, you encountered a saber-toothed tiger, and this tiger greeted you with a very loud, threatening growl, and his big incisor teeth were glaring at you, and so your amygdala would jump into action and trigger a fear response, rather than encouraging you to go over there and pet the kitty, right? So in this case, you would either fight or flee or hide. But in addition, since this experience was accompanied by strong emotions, it would also be processed into a lifelong memory. So in other words, the next time you left your hut or your cave or whatever, you would generalize. In other words, you would know that all tigers, not only the one you met, are dangerous. And you, therefore, would wisely avoid being around them. Now, this was very useful back then. But in modern life, it creates a huge problem, especially if you're already hardwired to have an overly active amygdala like people on the autism spectrum and all across the spectrum have. So now fast forward to today, a child with high functioning autism or Asperger's is unfortunate to experience unsuccessful attempts at making friends, keeping friends, and socializing. In many cases, he wants to make friends, he just can't quite fit in, and so he gets ostracized, rejected, ridiculed, and even bullied. The uncomfortable feelings this will inevitably produce, coupled with the memory processing of the amygdala, will unfortunately start a vicious cycle of generalization and avoidance behavior. And what this means is the child will associate people with distressing emotions, and that'll stimulate anxiety, which will in turn reduce the child's ability to interact with people and interpret their behaviors positively. So when I say he generalizes, he in essence makes a thinking error that because these one or two people mistreated me, therefore all people will mistreat me. Now you fast forward to adulthood, where this person is trying to get into a romantic relationship with a neurotypical. He's already on guard. He's already been through a lifetime of rejection and ridicule, and now he's in the situation where he has to be highly social, which is not his cup of tea. And since he struggles socially, relationship problems inevitably occur. And as his partner tries to correct the relationship, sometimes this gets downloaded in his brain, the Asperger's brain, as criticism, and he has flashbacks to previous criticism, and so he is quick to feel like he's being yet again ridiculed, put down, and made to feel like shit. You could think of your Asperger's husband in this case as someone who has a severe sunburn. And you know, when you've ever had a severe sunburn, just a touch, just a mild touch by somebody else leaves you screaming. And so your Asperger's husband has already suffered some emotional damage from social failures previously in his life. And so now the slightest touch, in other words, the slightest positive or even constructive criticism, will be felt as painful criticism and put-downs. I hope that makes sense. And at the very least, maybe you can understand why he is so super sensitive to criticism.
He knows that he sucks at social skills because he probably learned that as a child. And so if you were a little kid and your parents signed you up for Little League or T-ball or whatever, and you just didn't have the knack for that, and you got benched, you just basically sucked. So you ended up kind of being the bat boy, and it was a terrible experience. I'm never playing baseball again. I suck at that. I was never any good at it. They started me way out in the outfield, and then the coach wasn't even happy with me way out there, and he just benched me, and I just sat on the bench the entire season. So now that I have been benched by the coach, and I know that I'm not a good baseball player, and then somebody comes along and says, oh, well, would you like to join this team and learn how to play baseball? It's like, no, I've already been around that block. I suck at it. No. I don't have any interest in learning baseball or learning how to be a better pitcher or a better batter, and I'm perfectly fine not playing baseball. And so that's exactly what's going on with your husband, is that he knows he's terrible at it. He's had a bad experience with it, and talking is a social activity. Of course he doesn't want to talk. And it's a shame that he feels that way, because social skills can be taught, and the give and take in conversation can be taught. And he would actually get to the point where he probably enjoy conversing and enjoy talking, because he's actually doing it fairly adeptly for the first time in his life. So he might even find some joy in having conversation about something other than his topic of interest. So another common concern that comes up with NT wives about their autistic husband is she will say something along the lines of, he won't answer my questions. I'll ask him, what took you so long? He will say, I don't know. Or she'll ask, what are you planning to do with such and such? And he'll say, never mind. Or he just won't respond to her questions at all. And so what's up with this in the vast majority of cases is he knows that if he answers that question, that's just going to open the floodgates for a bunch of other questions. Or he's simply afraid to answer the question because he feels like he's going to get in trouble for the answer. So if you have asked him a question and then he answers your question, but then you follow that up with 12 other questions, he's going to download that as I'm being interrogated, this raises my anxiety. Or if you have asked a question and he gave you the answer and you didn't like it and then you had a problem with the answer and chastised him accordingly, then he's going to be gun shy about answering any of your questions. Or he is going to give you the answer that he thinks you want to hear just to get you off of his back. So one of the things that you could do in this case would be to let him know prior to asking the question that you're not going to be asking follow-up questions, or he's not going to be in trouble for the answer to the question. So you could say, I've got one question. I would like the answer to it. I promise not to follow that up with a dozen other questions, and I promise not to use your answer as an opportunity to get punitive or parental. So if he knows he's not going to be interrogated or criticized, he's going to be much more likely to answer your one question.
So people with Asperger's or high-functioning autism, they have emotions, but they turn their emotions way down. Not completely off, just way down. And the reason they do this, it's because they have learned to turn their emotions way down because they get in the way of making evidence-based decisions. People with Asperger's truly are very logical, in fact, overly logical, and under-emotional. They don't understand their feelings. They don't understand other people's feelings so much. So, to people with Asperger's, words are not evidence. They're just words. To them, words are just tools to convey a thought or a process, and they're inherently empty. Words are inherently empty until they're filled with truth. So it's not that people with Asperger's have little room for emotions. They just don't see any need for them. In fact, in their way of thinking, emotions just get in the way of completing tasks. Emotions just get in the way of problem solving. In fact, their motto could be remove the emotions and accomplish the task more efficiently. So they are very task-oriented. They're very much into their special interests, and their special interests very rarely, if ever, involve people. So it's not that they have to have things their way all the time. I know that if you're an NT spouse of an Asperger's husband or wife, you know that it seems like they always have to have it their way. It's their way or the highway, and they're so stubborn. Once they've locked in to their opinion, they can't be swayed otherwise. But it's not that they have to have their way all the time. If you, as the NT wife or husband, can provide some reasonable logic with proof that your way is better than theirs, they will listen to what you have to say, and they'll go along with your plan. So, to help you understand why you're back to the email from this NT wife, to help you understand why your Asperger's husband is overly logical and doesn't really connect with you on an emotional level, just remember that in his mind, words are only uncorroborated statements, not evidence. They think that neurotypical people say things all the time that have no value because NTs often say things that aren't backed by evidence. They're always searching for evidence. What's the truth? They're very aspies, or very truth-oriented and very fact-oriented. So they often disregard words as empty, meaningless garbage. They only respect the truth. So when your words are logical and match his logic, when your words are truthful and matches his sense of truth, both of you will be on the same page. Now I understand that therein lies the dilemma, because you don't speak Asperger's, so to speak, right? There's French, there's German. You may or may not speak French. You may or may not speak German. And if you're a neurotypical spouse, you definitely don't speak Asperger's. Your brain is simply not wired the way the Asperger's brain is wired. And so it is hard to kind of get on the same page with your Asperger's husband when he's so damn logical all the time, because that's just simply not your style. Another reason that there may seem to be a disconnect when you're talking to your Asperger's husband and he's overly logical is the fact that he doesn't speak body language. So let's use the analogy of French and German again. You know, you may or may not speak French, you may or may not speak German, but you definitely speak body language. The person with Asperger's does not speak body language. In other words, they don't pick up on facial cues. They don't pick up on body language, like if you're crossing your arms, if you have a disgusted look or a sad look or an empathic look, they're just not going to get that. So they're only listening, they're only picking up on what you have to say, not on the body language behind what you're saying. And to make matters worse, and we just alluded to this earlier, if you're not providing factual evidence in your arguments or when you're giving your opinion, not only is your body language discounted, but your words are also discounted, or not valued, we'll say. So I know this doesn't help you feel better as you're dealing with your husband, but hopefully at least help you understand why there seems to be this disconnect and why you're sucked into these lengthy lectures, overly logical lectures that you refer to.
And today I want to talk about impaired social interaction in people on the autism spectrum, and this may help you understand why you don't get the emotional reciprocity that you need, want, and desire from your spouse on the spectrum. So there's various theories as to why people on the autism spectrum have impaired social skills. Some researchers suggest that poor social skills can be caused by a weakness or an absence of the social gaze response, and we'll talk about that here shortly. It may be caused by sensory distractions, which prevent the person from concentrating on social issues. Could be caused by memory dysfunction. For example, deficits in memory for faces and common social scenes, which prevent the person from remembering other people or events. It could also be caused by failure to develop a theory of mind, which prevents the person from understanding what other people are thinking or feeling. And lastly, it might be caused by failure of affective processing. Affective processing simply means being able to understand one's emotions and perhaps the emotions in others. So people on the autism spectrum, with respect to social interactions, have difficulty with social responses. Specifically, they tend to be inflexible, they tend not to understand context, and they tend to have difficulty generalizing. So let me explain this in more detail. The relationship between social interactions and proper social responses are flexible, context-dependent, and generalizable. For example, general and unspoken social rules are supposed to govern how a person responds when he or she meets someone for the first time. But the specifics of the meeting are never precise and depend on the context. For example, whether the new acquaintance is a neighbor, a teacher, a classmate, a coworker, etc. Another example would be, let's say, family members get together for a family reunion, okay? So there's no doubt going to be handshakes, hugs, and kisses, but exactly how tight a hug will be, or exactly where a kiss will be planted, or exactly what people will be talking about is both variable and context dependent. Neurotypicals can intuitively interact with others in a way that is flexible. Variability does not throw them off. They understand the context of the social event, and they can generalize from one event to another event. But people on the autism spectrum have difficulty in these areas. The subtle nuances in relationships are difficult. So what does the individual on the spectrum do instead? They tend to learn things, especially social things and emotional things, by rote memory. The person's style of learning is such that he or she will try to store each social experience by rote memory. A strong aptitude for rote memory is a typical cognitive tendency among people on the autism spectrum. For example, these individuals may demonstrate the ability to repeat the script of an entire movie verbatim, or recall specific dates that nobody else is even considering. However, this capacity for strong rote memory may also be accompanied by challenges in simple recall. For example, you may have talked to your spouse earlier one morning and you asked him to do something, and then 2 or 3 hours later, you asked him if he followed through. He said no, and I don't even remember what you asked me to do. Yet he may be able to mention all of the generals in the Civil War, for example. So while rote memory helps one retain data and facts, it doesn't help with gauging the give and take aspects of social interactions. Without extracting complex social cues from multidimensional social interactions, the person on the autism spectrum can't effectively use the stored information to generalize to new related social situations. The best that person can do is to follow rigidly the memory entry that best matches the current situation as a script. Many of you have heard of Temple Grandin. She's an autistic author, and she wrote about how she handled social situations better as she got older because she accumulated more examples in her visual library and could find a better match to each social situation. Here's another example of the business of using rote memory, since social responses tend not to be flexible, context dependent, or generalizable in the person on the autism spectrum. Let's say, for example, we have a college student, and we have, in this case, he or she is a neurotypical, and so this person is sitting in class, and so by observing his professor's behavior, which is called gaze attention, the non-autistic or neurotypical student is usually able to predict the professor's intentions. For example, what the teacher is going to do next, what he might say next, and so on. So as a result, this student may get a pencil and piece of paper from his desk. He may raise his hand to ask a question. He may open a certain textbook, or simply sit quietly without taking any action. Exactly what will happen is variable and depends on the context. For example, whether the professor is writing something on the blackboard, is looking at the group of students with her arms crossed, or has moved from her desk to the classroom exit. Conversely, the autistic student, by virtue of a rote learning style, attempts to store each instance separately and precisely and fails to extract the ambiguous, context-dependent relationship between the professor's body language and her intention. Now, I had mentioned earlier that one reason for poor social skills may be a weakness or absence of the social gaze response. Now, what people on the autism spectrum tend to do instead of that is gaze aversion. So compared to neurotypical people who look at others' faces, especially the eyes, people on the autism spectrum do this much less frequently, and that's called gaze aversion. So one reason for their gaze aversion is that the relationship between facial expression and the other person's feelings or motives is hard for the person to comprehend. One of the traits of autism is difficulty understanding facial cues, body language, how tone of voice and volume of voice changes the context. So if the person can't glean nonverbal information provided in facial expressions, then he or she will be less interested in looking at the faces of others, which further reduces his or her chance of gleaning important nonverbal information in social interactions. Another reason for gaze aversion is that the human face is very complex. It's a dynamic stimulus that may overload the sensory sensitivities of the person trying to observe the other's behavior. And this makes it very difficult to read another person's facial expressions, body language, and so on. So it is for these reasons that your spouse on the autism spectrum has impaired social interaction, and unfortunately in the NT's mind, this often downloads as he is selfish, insensitive, uncaring, self-absorbed, even narcissistic. And I'm not saying that none of that happens ever, but a good 80% of what's going on here is simply this business of not instinctively and intuitively and naturally getting into the flow, especially the emotional flow of social interactions. One of the problems that you ladies are having is he's got this very narrow range of interests. It's about the size of the little hole that you stick the thread in the sewing needle. And anything that falls outside of that, which is about 99% of what you want, he's not going to have a whole lot of vested interest in it because it's not even remotely in his special interest area.
Hey, this is Mark Hutten. Would you like to schedule a one-on-one Zoom call? Okay, it's so simple. Just look under any of my videos in the description area. Click on this Calendly link. Now you see my calendar. Pick your month, your day, anytime that's available. Enter your name and email address. Then you'll get a follow-up email with the Zoom link on the day and time that you picked. And voila, we will talk.